Hi everybody, this is Maya Good. This is my NaNoWriMo Day 6 update. Pardon me, I am exhausted. I was up most of the night and I've come to a decision that I'm really struggling with, and that is that my NaNoWriMo is over. I'm realizing a couple things. I'm not happy this NaNoWriMo. I'm not I like my story that I'm working on, the short story, and I started working on the second one. I realized I'm just feeling really forced, and that the words aren't coming as purely because I want to have the time to really contemplate and consider my writing. And I had a big thing happen yesterday that just completely sidetracked it, and I thought it sidetracked it in a good way, not in a bad way. So I'm not upset about it at all. I was in writing group and we were talking about the next chapter that we were critiquing of my book. And suddenly the main problem that I had with the opening of my book came into really clear focus. And figuring out what the structural problem was one of the main issues I was having with revising past. And once I came home, I realized I just did not want to be writing 50,000 words of short stories when I could be fixing this. And I know how to fix it now. And I didn't know how to fix it before. And I'm really excited about the fact that now I know what's wrong with my book. And once I get that cleared up, everything else just kind of flows into place. Like as I imagine the story, I'm like, okay, if the first four chapters do this, then this makes sense, and this makes sense, and this problem I was having in chapter 23 makes sense. And it's all based on this really core developmental problem that I was having with my arc. So, I came home and I thought about that, and I was like, no, 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 no. You already committed to NaNoWriMo. Sure, you didn't really, your heart wasn't in it when you started, but you've committed. So I started working on my short story, and it's just not right. And it's just because I'm forcing myself to write too quickly. Um, and this is hard for me because NaNoWriMo means a lot to me. Without NaNoWriMo, I wouldn't have two novel rough drafts that are decent enough to revise. Without NaNoWriMo, I wouldn't have started writing short stories and reading short stories and focusing on my writing so exclusively and knowing that that is my life goal, to be an author. And so stepping away from that and recognizing that it isn't right for me is just really hard. And I went through a similar struggle last year because last year I wanted to do it and my heart just wasn't in it. And I'm realizing that I don't actually enjoy fast drafting. And that's something that I didn't realize until now. The first two times I liked it, and I think it was because I hadn't um, I hadn't taken within myself this understanding that I am a finisher, that I'm capable of finishing rough drafts. But now that I've finished rough drafts and I've finished final drafts of short stories, that's already in there. And so now when I write quickly, I feel like I'm doing my story a disservice. And I'm much happier writing 500 words at a pop than I am writing 1,600 words at a pop. And I feel like my writing is better and I'm happier writing at that slower pace. And so deciding to step away from NaNoWriMo is just, I'm very, very conflicted. The truth is, next year, my goal is to submit a bunch of short stories to journals. In order to do that, I have to write a bunch of short stories. And they have to be good. They have to be at a level that I consider something that I would be proud of putting out into the world. And for me, like the last story that I was working on, it's the best story I've ever written. And it's the one that I was the slowest in developing. I spent several weeks developing that story before I ever put a word on the page. And in the end, it actually took me less time to write that story than any other short story because I put so much planning and I'd taken so much time in writing it, and I wrote it at a slower pace. When I was done, my rough draft was much more like a 10th draft of my previous work. And so while I love NaNoWriMo and while I think it's important and I think it's great for people, I'm coming back to the decision I had last year that I think I've just outgrown it. I'm at a place now where I want to be doing a lot of reading. I want to be dissecting. I want to be figuring out where I need to work on my writing. I want to be doing all these really specific things, and turning out a lot of words isn't necessarily getting me there. And even though turning out a lot of words gets me a nice rough draft I can work on, it does it in a way that doesn't seem to be fitting with the style and of writing that I'm doing and my goals my personal goals as a writer. So I am stopping NaNoWriMo officially, as far as I'm no longer trying to get to 50,000 words. I will be writing through the month. There are several short stories I need to finish because a couple of the submissions are in January. I will also be working on revising the first quarter of my novel and fixing the developmental problems that I now understand more fully. And it was funny because I'd heard the exact same thing when I was at the Napa Valley Writers Conference, but I didn't fully understand it. So I couldn't take what was told to me and implement it because I was still wrapping my head around what it meant. And then someone at the writing group, when she said it clicked back to what my previous writing instructor had told me about that novel, and it clicked. I was like, that's what she meant. Now I get it. Now I can go back and rewrite and cut apart and know what to cut because now I understand what she was talking about. And it definitely feels like a milestone, like a really big milestone. Also, because I am working on stories for publication, I've got a lot of revision and editing, and that takes me time, and that's time away from drafting. So next week, I will be submitting a short story to a journal, and it's going to take some minor tweaks, and then I have to go through it very, very slowly for all the grammar and the typos and the line editing, and that takes me a long time because it doesn't come easy for me. So next week is going to be a long week. I'm going to be spending probably 5-6 hours just copy editing that story before I send it in. And knowing that I'm revising the first quarter of past, finishing, 10-15,000 words of short story just isn't reasonable. And it's pushing myself to do something that's going to cause me to drop a lot of other balls. So that's where I'm at. The short story I'm currently working on, I'm really liking it. I've definitely hit a point in the story where the plot that I had lined out isn't working. I need to do some meditation and figuring out and just daydreaming the story and figuring out what's wrong with it before I continue. The opening of the story is perfect as far as it's doing exactly what I want it to do. There's a couple scenes in the middle of, if you broke it up into 3 acts, there's a couple scenes towards the middle of Act 1, beginning of Act 2, I guess, like closer to Act 2 than Act 1, than the beginning of Act 1. There's a few things that just aren't working, and I think it's just a matter of cutting and consolidation, but I'm not worrying about that because that's going to be fairly good work. That's not going to be that difficult. I'm good at cutting, but figuring out how to transition into how to change the tone of the story more slowly and get across the messages and the ideas that I want to get across, that's going to take me a little more time. So right now what I'm doing is I'm reading a lot of George Saunders, and I am just thinking about the story a lot. And I keep going back to the story, and I write a couple hundred words, and I'm like, that's not quite what I'm going for. So then I put that in the dump drive, and I write a couple more hundred words. I'm like, that's closer. I'm getting closer. And I think it really is the idea of, the most obvious part of the idea isn't the best idea. I was actually, a long time ago, I was listening to an author interview about short stories, and the writer, I don't remember who it was saying, you take your basic idea and you have your ending, and your first idea for the ending is usually the most obvious idea, and you don't want that idea. You want to go deeper. And I like that idea a lot. And then I was recently reading an interview with George Saunders, and he was talking about when he wrote the Simplicate Girl Diaries, that his initial idea, again, the initial idea was obvious. It was blatant, it was out there, and the story wouldn't be good unless there was an additional idea in there. And so that's what I'm looking for right now for that short story, is I'm looking for that story beneath the story, not just the basic, easy, low-hanging fruit, but what's underneath that. And the things that are underneath that are probably much more interesting. So that's where I'm at with my writing. My reading is going great. I'm enjoying my reading right now. I am almost done with 10th of December, and when I'm done, I will definitely do a book review. Two of the stories I've read twice before. I've read Simplico Diaries with Literary Roadhouse, and I read dang it, what is the name of that story? Oh, that's going to drive me crazy. But there were two stories that I read on Literary Roadhouse. And as I was going back through 10th of December, I was able to reread those stories. And there were a lot of additional stories that I've never heard before, and I'm enjoying his style. I'm finding that the story I'm currently working on very much is kind of within that style. It's much more comical. It's much more talkative language, first person. And so reading these stories is kind of helping me out as far as what works and what doesn't, and how to do that well, and the different styles of doing a literary story in first person. I'm finding it very, very helpful. So far, my favorite stories from there are Puppy and Escape from Spiderhead. That's the other one. Escape from Spiderhead. I've actually read that one before. I love Escape from Spiderhead on like so many levels. I love that story. Puppy really surprised me. It snuck up on me. It was a much more quiet story, and originally I listened to that one in audio, and then when I read it on paper, I found it a much more intriguing story. I am also finding I'm not enjoying audiobooks as much as I used to. I used to love them, and I think my style of reading has changed so that when I listen to an audiobook, I feel like I'm missing too much. There are things that just kind of float by and I don't notice. Whereas when I read the words, I notice a lot more. I'm much more attentive. When I listen to an audiobook, I'm also finding that I'm now having to rewind a great deal because I want to get those details. Whereas before, when I was listening to audiobooks, it was much more just about enjoying the story, and I didn't get a sense that I was missing anything. So definitely my reading over the last year has changed. I noticed it changed last year, but I think this year it was much more dramatic with the addition of the Literary Roadhouse Book Club. For anyone that's curious, because I know someone mentioned in the comments of my last video wanting to know what book club I was talking about, it isn't a Goodreads book club. We did have a Goodreads group, but the podcasts were too new, and so it just fizzled. There weren't enough people yet. And so if you're curious about what I'm talking about, it's literaryroadhouse.com. We have a weekly podcast on short stories where we read and discuss a short story, and then we have a monthly podcast on books. And we also have a weekly podcast on writing. The writing podcast, I'm still getting caught up on the audio editing, but they're coming out fairly more regularly. I've got a bunch more episodes in the queue to come out like every couple of days next week. So that's what I talk about when I talk about the book club. I'm talking about the podcast book club. And so because I'm reading these books that are really a stretch for me, and I'm having to analyze them and having to discuss them afterwards, I'm finding that my reading is changing in a really, really good way, and in a way that's helping my writing a great deal. My writing is so much better than it was 3 years ago. It really is night and day, and I'm hoping to continue that improvement. So that's where I'm at with NaNoWriMo. You know, the thing is, I'm not even disappointed about stepping away. What I'm disappointed about is the feeling of letting people down, because everybody wanted me to do NaNoWriMo, and when I went into it this year, I knew I didn't want to do it, and I tried to figure out a way to make it work for me by doing it with short stories, since I already had this goal. I thought, well, since it's something I already want to do, I'm going to love that. And I'm just not loving it. And I just have to own that. If I'm not enjoying it, then that's kind of the point. You do NaNoWriMo because you enjoy it. Will I still go to the NaNoWriMo write-ins? Yes. Am I still going to write during the month? Yes. But that 50,000 goal, it's not even on my radar now. My goal really is to do really good work on my novel and get a couple short stories ready for submission for January. So that's where I'm at. Until next time, ciao.